I'm Charles Beckett from St. Thomas area, and in my early days I worked for the County of Elgin when I got done high school, finished grade 13, and I decided there's more to life than this manual labor for the County of Elgin at 65 cents an hour. So I found out that the telegraphers on this railway system here in town, whoever you work for, were getting $1.25 an hour. That seemed like a wonderful opportunity for me to do well. So I applied at the New York Central Railway at the Canada Southern Station, known as the Michigan Central Depot in my day, and applied there for a job as a telegrapher. And the reason I chose that was because I'd already learned telegraphy in the Army Cadets when I was 16. So here I was 18 and now wanting a job on the railway. And they said, sorry, this is October, and we won't be using any spare telegraphers until next spring. If you want to hire on then, you'll have to pass the wire test for the Morse telegraph, American Morse code, by the spring. And I said, well, I already got Morse code. And they said, no, you've got international, and we have a different code. And you'll have to learn that over the winter and pass to get on in the spring to start your career. So I went out. They said, you can go out to see the agent in Shedden. And so I went out to see Vince Bury, the NYC agent at Shedden, Ontario. There was 2 stations in Shedden, and wouldn't you know it, I went to the wrong one. I went to the Chesapeake, Ohio, PM, I believe, Père Marquette it was called then, in the 50s, in 1951, in the fall there, and was directed over to the right one, the New York Central, where Vince Bury was, and found Vince. And he said, yep, for a certain sum, princely sum, I thought at the time, but anyway, he would teach me for 2 months and get me up to speed on railroad American Morse telegraphy. And then he'd touch me up in the spring again for no extra charge to get ready for the wire test, to get hired on. So I did. I spent 2 months in 1951 learning telegraphy and a little bit about station agent work at Shedden, Ontario, west of St. Thomas. I rode out in my motorcycle. I remember I got some fond memories and not so fond memories. I had a Harley Davidson 1942 Harley, and Davidson and I rode it out there to every day, and I had to learn to light the fire, and then the agent would come in a little later, and I'd have the station already open. He'd showed me where the key was and how to get in, and I had to light the fire and get the fire going before he got there, and it wouldn't be very long before we'd have the office nice and warm in the wintertime there. Very cold weather in November and December. And anyway, Christmas I was okayed that I could do 20 words a minute, he figured, so I was done. I'd paid my money to him, and so I disappeared out of the woodwork and did part-time work throughout the winter to pay my room and board at home. And in the spring I went back to the railway by arrangement and passed the Morse code test around the 12th of May in 1952. And I got my 20 words a minute along with 7 other applicants, but I was promised to be the first hired because I had applied in 1951, and sure enough they listed me on the seniority roster as a telegrapher with a seniority date of May the 22nd, 1952. Very important thing for a railroad guy to have his seniority established. So on May the 22nd, 1952, I was at work on the railway at a non-telegraph location called E&O Crossing. It's an interlocker down near Welland, Ontario. And that's how I got started.
Thank you. Yep, that seemed like a good time to do it.
I certainly want to recount one of my favorite railway memories.
We ready? Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
One of my favorite railway memories of my working here was when we had the St. Clair branch in operation until I think the mid-60s. I was on the spare board for about 15 years, from 1952 to about 1968. And during that period I worked up and down the line at almost every station and interlocker, any place of work where 132 of us telegraphers were assigned on this Canada division. I was number 132 on the list. But I worked spare board to relieve for vacation relief, and also for anybody that was off sick for any like disability or whatever. But one of the jobs that came up constantly was the St. Clair branch, because on the St. Clair branch there was a train agent. He started in St. Thomas Monday to Saturday one week and Monday to Thursday the next. So he worked 6 days one week and 4 the next, because the train went up to Courtright from St. Thomas, stayed overnight, and then come back the next day. So every day was a 2-day assignment, every trip. And so you would work 6 days one and 4 the next. So on the 2 days that the regular agent didn't work, a spare board man like myself that was qualified on that job, okayed to work the job, and had telegraphy, could go up on that and relieve him. So he had Friday and Saturday off every other week. And so somebody could fill in whoever was available on the seniority basis on the spare board. So quite often I was available and sent and covered those 2 days. And one of my favorite occupations was in the evening up there on the night we stayed over, was to watch the fireman. He was actually called an engine hostler. I remember his name was Jack. I can't think of his last name right now. But at the time I went up there in the 50s and 60s, it was Jack somebody, and he was a hostler. And his job was to refill the coal tender on the 1290 or the 1291 steam engines that went up that branch. And he had to refill the tender with coal from a gondola car of coal. Well, you could imagine shoveling a gondola car, which is fairly low and flat, up into over the top of a tender, which was higher. And it was quite a job, and it was a manual job. He did it with a shovel, a fireman's shovel. And he would empty a half a carload every other night. He worked like I did, 4 or 5 nights a week, and he had the job of doing filling the tender of the steam engine. But one night I was up there, and I used to like to go and sit with Jack and talk with him as he worked. We could carry on a bit of a conversation, him doing a lot of grunting and groaning as he shoveled the coal from the floor of the gondola up into the tender. And one night I was sitting there with him and talking. I was looking down in the water after dark, and I could see a shadow in the water going upstream. And I said, "Jack, there's something in the water. It seems to be going against the current." He says, "Oh," he says, "that'll be one of those large bottom feeders. What are they called?" And he named the fish. He says, "They grow about 6 feet long." And I said, "Well, this looks like a 6 or 8 foot long fence post." And he says, "That's what it is. It's one of those river fish that grow huge and live a long time." And so I saw one of them. I forget the name of it. Not a muskie. It's another name. I forget at the moment what it was. But anyway, I still remember being excited over seeing something moving upstream in the dark, just under the top of the water, just down in a little ways, and knowing there's something moving there going up against the current in the St. Clair River down below Sarnia there at Courtright. But that's one of my favorite railroad related memories is that particular evening of sitting with Jack and seeing this fish swim upstream.
Well, tell us a bit more about the 1290 that made that run and some of the challenges of running a steam engine that late.
Yeah, well, okay, the 1290 and the 1291 were stationed in St. Thomas, and they were designed and built here in St. Thomas in these shops for work on, in fact, they were built, I think, prior to the, they were definitely built prior to the new shop, what we call the MCR locomotive repair facility here. It's now the Elgin County Museum. They were built in the old shops. But anyway, they were both built for branch service. At that time, the Canada Division of the New York Central had a lot of branches that stemmed way back from Canada's Southern days and Michigan Central days. There was the Chippewa branch, the Niagara branch, the Amherstburg branch, and the Leamington branch, to name the major ones. And the 1290 and the 1291 were assigned strictly to branch service. They were designed for light duty, could pull a train maybe of 15 cars readily, freight cars, and were good for operating on light rail, like 80-pound rail, going up the branch, and very slow too. They could handle very slow speeds all day long. And so that you either had the 1290 or the 1291 ahead of you. When you got on the train here in St. Thomas, right at the station, they made up the St. Clair branch train at St. Thomas Depot, and we had the car put on there every trip for the agent to ride in, the agent's car. And he was a traveling agent because we stopped at certain stations that didn't have an agency. Some of them did, like Petrolia and Inwood. Those two, and there was another one. Anyway, Petrolia and Inwood and another one on the branch that had a day agent working there. There was enough business that they were looking, but other stations had closed, and the train agent on the train stopped there and helped the crew unload mattresses and eggs and whatever, chickens or whatever was ordered in to that area for the local people. We unloaded at the station, unlocked the door, put it inside, and at a nearby mailbox handed out the notices that their freight had arrived and their express had arrived. And so we did express and freight and less than carload freight for all these little stations up and down the line that didn't have an agent. It was very interesting work. We did stop on the Indian reservation too. It was one of the stops for that very purpose. Nobody was there, except sometimes when you arrive, somebody's there waiting for their mattress or box springs from Simpson Sears or from Eaton's catalog. And sometimes you had to unload right through their arms, and they would show that they had ordered it and were supposed to be picking it up, and that we would hand it over to them. So that was one of my memories too. But the 1290 and 1291 were wonderful little steam engines with a footplate, and I rode the back of both of them on various trips up the St. Clair branch. And of course I was familiar with it when I worked at the agency at Leamington, with where the Heinz Company was the principal consignee and shipper, major client there, and one of them would be assigned down there, and every so often they'd have to come back to St. Thomas for a monthly redo or whatever inspection. But meanwhile they'd just be sitting there quietly overnight like at Leamington, and then they'd fire it up in the morning and get going again and do the switching around the whole town and take the train out to Comber and back. That was the Leamington. The Amherstburg did the same thing. It would go back and forth on the Amherstburg branch. And sometimes they used back into Windsor and stayed in Windsor for the night too. But anyway, the branch work was very important business on the Canada Southern at that time.
And eventually you stopped traveling so much, and you had a couple more stationary jobs here, both dispatcher and working in the BX tower. Could you first tell us a bit about how telegraphy was used on the railway and how that fit into your future jobs?
The telegraphy that we all had to learn, most of us had to learn it. If you didn't learn telegraphy, you could still work in some of those positions that we covered. We telegraphs were called operators, O-P-E-R-A-T-O-R-S, on the New York Central. And the operators covered agencies and ticket offices and interlockers and drawbridges and and switch tender work, all kinds of things that didn't fall into the categories of brakemen or whatever, or clerks. And so we did clerical work. Windsor Yard, for instance, we had a clerk's job at Windsor, and we didn't use any telegraphy in that job. We did all telephone work. By the time I relieved in Windsor on the clerk's job in the yard office, I was on the phone all day and looking up records of freight movement between Windsor and Detroit. That was when we had tunnel engines, electric yard engines, took everything over to and back between Detroit and Windsor on the electric system. But anyway, the telegraph was used in almost every station, but not at BX, and not at, I think it was E&O, didn't have it either. By the time I relieved at E&O, in 1952, I first worked E&O, and I'm pretty sure it didn't have telegraph. No, it didn't have telegraph. So, but you had good telephone service, an internal telephone service on the railway, their own system. So the telegraph was important for some of us. I could telegraph, so I could learn any job that had telegraph or didn't have telegraph. Another fellow that joined with me that hired on that same day, he failed his telegraph his test, and he was authorized to work in places like BX Tower and WX Tower and Tower 4 and Tower 3 and Tower 2, and I can't remember what all, a whole bunch of stations that didn't have telegraph. But most freight stations you had to have telegraph because you made telegraphic reports daily. So it was quite important that you couldn't work it unless you could do the reports and send them in by telegraph. So he couldn't work some of the jobs I worked.
On the internal telephone system that you're talking about, I think I remember you talking about a well-known operator out of St. Thomas.
Yes.
Could you tell me a bit about her?
Yes. Well, the local telephone system was operated through a switchboard in St. Thomas, Ontario here, right up in the second floor of the Canada Southern Station. Michigan Central, or New York Central Depot, as we often called it, we employees. It was a kind of an Americanized term, I think, depot. But at the depot there, Marie was assigned to be the switchboard operator Monday to Friday from 8 to 5. Or 8, I think it was 8 to 5. And anyway, so in the daytime, when a lot of clerks and offices were open on the railway, that's when she was there to help you get through to your destination. So if you were in St. Thomas and wanted to call Windsor, you would plug in and give a little ring, and she would answer, and yes, or Marie here, or whatever, and then and you'd say, Yardmaster Windsor, please, and she'd say, okay, and she'd say, I'm trying it on the message line here, clickety click, 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 and then maybe Yardmaster or the clerk would answer, or maybe not. So I'm going to try on the second message. She has a different phone she can try them on. And so she would finally get you connected to the party you're trying to call. And the same if you were trying to call Montrose, which is Niagara Falls, Ontario, yard there like Windsor Yard. Or if Montrose Yard wanted to call Windsor Yard, they could ring and they could get Marie, and she would patch them through all the way to Windsor. So you could talk to anybody from one end of the division to the other when she was on duty. But when she wasn't there, it wasn't so easy until they put in our own dial system, and then we could call from one end to the other.
Tell me a bit about working in the station and in the BX Tower. What the actual jobs were, and
Okay.
how you're controlling these trains from there.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was quite a number of jobs in the station that the telegraphers handled, and that included dispatching. You could be a dispatcher if you were promoted from the telegraph ranks, and be in charge of half the division at that time, and eventually, when business got lighter, you would be asked to control the whole division of all the train movements. Anybody wanting to get on the track for any purpose, for a train or a motor car or whatever, they would have to go on the dispatcher's line and get permission somehow through a local agent wherever they are, or on their own if they're out in the middle of nowhere. We had a phone every mile along the tracks. You never went more than a mile and a quarter from one phone to another. So if a train, the idea was if a train stopped, the head end or the tail end would be near a phone, maybe both. If you stopped with half the train and with the phone booth halfway, one of them could walk that half a mile, or both of them could, and get to that phone booth and let the people know, either the station before you or behind you or ahead of you, east or west of you, know that you're stopped unexpectedly to look for a problem on your train, and they would let the dispatcher know, and they could make other arrangements. If it was a serious problem, delays, that the dispatcher could arrange to get other trains to go around you. And so that was an important feature of train dispatching. But anyway, I digress. But I forget where I was at.
That's okay, we can pause for a second there. Yeah, we can.
Oh, the telephone, yeah.
All this will be edited. We're just talking, yeah. The conversion from the telegraph to the telephone to the radio,
Yeah.
is a fairly gradual one.
Yeah, well, okay. The interesting situation was, I think since around 1910 or so, we had our own telephone system on the railway. So along with the telegraph lines that were in place since 1873 when the Canada Southern was built, there was now telephone lines on the poles, and so some places didn't bother with the telegraph. they used the telephone line from station to station, from one end to the other. Like a yardmaster didn't have to go to the telegrapher anymore and ask him to telegraph to the other end of the line. He could get on there and he could go through Marie in the daytime, and or at night he could get through somehow on his own and talk to somebody with. So we had both systems from 1910 on, but by 1955 or 60, we were dropping the telegraph requirement for a lot of positions, and make it easier to find relief for people that didn't require them to have telegraphy in order to relieve an agent, say at Welland or somewhere. No longer was that a requirement. So they started reducing it because people coming on board hadn't had a chance. There was no telegraph schools any longer in these towns to learn it, and it was difficult to get people to spend their own time and money ahead of time before they hired on to get telegraphy. So anyway, it became important for the railway to use more and more telephone and less telegraphy. And eventually, all the branches became non-telegraph. Like the St. Clair branch was telegraph until approximately 1962. Everything was done back and forth by telegraph, everything. The train orders, like when you went to St. Clair, you would have to book off by telegraph. And when you wanted to get back on in the morning, you had to copy orders in order to run from St. Clair Junction there back to, from Corunna, Courtright, that is, the correct name is Courtright back to St. Clair Junction to the main line. You'd have to get a train order, and so it took a telegrapher to copy it on the telegraph wire. But eventually they reduced that and said, no, we're going to just drop the telegraph and put in telephone service. You can dial on the bell.
And can you explain what a train order is?
Well, a train order is issued by an authority such as a train dispatcher, or nowadays he's called I forget what he's called nowadays. Anyway, the train dispatcher was the name of the position of the person that's charged by the railroad to look after all the movements on a given territory. So on here, when I hired on, the train dispatcher on duty between St. Thomas and Windsor would be in St. Thomas in the office, and he would be looking after all the movements on that track while he's on duty is 8 hours between St. Thomas and Windsor. And the other desk up there looked after all the train movements on the tracks between St. Thomas and Niagara Falls, Ontario, at the Niagara Bridge, Suspension Bridge, and so and at Fort Erie too. So anyway, there was an East Division and a West Division, we called it, but each one was a half a division, and we had one division, officially Canada Division, but it was dispatched when times were busy throughout the war and whatnot, and from say 1910 on by two dispatchers, not one, and a chief on duty to oversee both of these train dispatchers to make sure they're remembering to set up orders ahead of time before something was required. And so anyway, it was a busy office. The train dispatcher office had a number of people, and a dozen people that were assigned to that office. The relay office upstairs too, next door, was telegraphers year-round until around 1962. 7 days a week, night or day, the telegraph office was copying not only orders, but many other messages, internal messages, and sending them out again. And did commercial telegraphy too. If somebody came to the ticket office downstairs and said, I want to send a telegram to Toronto or Ottawa or something, we could do that. We'd send it upstairs, and the relay office up there would quickly dispatch the telegram away. So anyway, we had all those different jobs. That's where the 132 jobs came from that I mentioned back in 1952, which ended up in 1989 when I stood there and was accepting my notice of retirement, that they were closing the office down. I was the second man on the list. Out of 132, I was now number 2. I had moved up 130 moves, and yet I was being laid off before my retirement date came up, because they were selling out to another railway and the other railway was moving the train order office from St. Thomas to Toronto. So that's what happened in that respect.
Tell me about how traffic control and yard control worked at the BX Tower. You spent time at the BX Tower. Could you give us a bit of an outline?
Oh yeah, during my 15 years as 16 years as a spare operator, I worked at BX Tower over those years, starting about 1953 to 1968, in vacation relief. Just at the moment, I might be finishing one vacation relief for 2 weeks somewhere, and when it started at BX, I would want the one at BX right in St. Thomas instead of down at Leamington or the other end of the road, because I was still trying to live in St. Thomas for most of that period, although I did live at Welland for 2 years in the mid-50s, and one of my children was born there while I was working at the station at Welland. But anyway, the whole thing was, I've forgotten.
BX Tower, we were talking about operations at BX and how they...
Yeah, I worked at BX Tower for vacation relief, and somebody would take their 2 weeks, and it would be known ahead of time that Frank or John or whatever his name was going to be on vacation, say 4 to 12 or midnights or swing job or the day job at BX Tower, which was around the clock interlocker right in St. Thomas. And if I stood for it, I would be glad to take it and work the levers there for the 2 week period. And when you worked at BX Tower, there was no telegraph, but you had to be adept at keeping trains moving north-south on the LMPS and east-west on the New York Central. And so you had, of course, you're being paid by the NYC, so guess who you had your your druthers for? You certainly favored the NYC moves. But the LMPS was very important too. They had so many trains, we didn't have to write them down on the train sheet. When we had a record of train movements there, and we still have sheets from way back in our possession here at the museum of the movements that the NYC had, but we don't show any LMPS moves at all because we had so many we couldn't bother writing them down. You'd be standing there running 2 LMPSs and get rid of them and then throw the levers out, change it over, and run your east-west train. Maybe just a switch engine at first, but then the freight train wants to go, then the passenger train is due. And BX was a very busy job in the 50s and into the early 60s before business tapered off and they started cutting more and more passenger trains and a few more freight trains too.
What was I going to ask? Can you tell me something? I'm going to go back a little bit. The station agent's car that was hooked up to the on the branch line, or right line. Did you stay in the car overnight, or did you?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell me a bit about living in the station agent car.
Well, okay. On the St. Clair branch, they had this assigned car. It was like a baggage car, and it had one end of it was your office for the regular agent and for his relief every other week. There was two days covered by a spare man, and so when you took over, he allowed you to use his cot. He had a cot, just a canvas cot that folds up and could be put out of sight, but the public never went in that car anyway. But anyway, he had his cot, and you could just go and lay on his cot and sleep there for the night on the Friday night when you went up Friday and come back Saturday, finish up his work week that he couldn't do because he had worked 6 the week before, 4 days that week. That made his 10 days by agreement with the union, that he had his 10 days in that 2 weeks. And so this worked well, but we slept, everybody, the regular agent and then his relief person slept on the cot in that car overnight in Courtright, Ontario, right along near the river, with a water murmuring right beside you. You could look out and walk around the car and look out the door and look out beside you, and there was the St. Clair River running right beside the tracks there.
Okay, and now I'm going to skip ahead a bit in time to ask you about your involvement with the Elgin County Railway Museum.
Yes. In, I think it was 1988, I knew that the steam locomotive was being donated to a new thing called the Elgin County Railway Museum. It was being formed through the auspices of John Wise, a member of Parliament, Conservative Party here in Elgin, and I think he was the Minister of Agriculture at the time. But anyway, somebody here had told him that we wanted to start a railway museum here in St. Thomas, and we would be delighted to have any large artifact. So he found out that this CN 5700 was being deemed surplus to requirements at the National Museum of Science and Technology in Ottawa, and so that it could go to somebody that could look after it and could find cover for it. So the 5700 had come here in 1988, I think it was October, and I think that's when it arrived, and we had arrangement with CN to put it in this MCR shop right here, which is now the Railway Museum, and they said that we could use their shop, which they had purchased from my former employee, the New York Central / Conrail. And anyway, so we had a place for it to go, so it got authorized that we could have this thing assigned to us. So Cliff Chaplow, a barber on Ross Street, and his friends, and they were organizing this museum, and they let me know they'd like me to join them. So they invited me out to a meeting at Bill Turvey's house out in the country there, and actually it's right on Wellington Road here. That's where he lived at the time, and Bill and Marie Turvey, and I went there, and sure enough there was Cliff and some other guys, I think Don, anyway, a local historian of note, and different ones that were there. And so I found out that they were getting serious about getting this museum going. They had this engine, and so anyway, I think it was 1989 by this time that they invited me out there, and they were trying to expand it to get more people like railroad guys and that involved, and they asked me to join, and I agreed to join. And I said, have you guys started a bank account yet? And they said, no, not yet. And I said, okay, here's my hat. Everybody throw in $20 that's here. Well, I'll put in 20 bucks and we'll start a bank account. What do you say to that? I said, okay, let's get serious. If you're serious, we're going to do it. And they said, okay, you're going to be treasurer. So the next meeting, I was appointed as secretary-treasurer by this budding railway museum, and we had a lawyer, Mr. Hennessy, who was digging up bylaws for us to incorporate, and did letters of incorporation, and I was involved with all of that. We went over everything in bylaws, and we opened the bank account, and we got started right in 1989. And by 1990, I still have my first 1990 issued membership card of the Elgin County Railway Museum. Very nice date that I have in my memory, a nice situation of these nice gentlemen that started up this museum, and I'm still active and supportive today.
Anything else you can think of, Hugh, right now?
No, I don't think so.
Anything else you want to add? Any other stories you'd like to add? I mean,
Yes.
please, go ahead.
Just a little.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention, I'd like you to know that in 1968, I was invited to try out to be a train dispatcher, which is a promotion, another 20–30% increase in money, but also a huge increase in responsibility to move up from this operator, which by now had become a guaranteed spare list, so I was making my 40 hours a week. But anyway, so I said, okay, I'll try it out. So I went up and worked with Ed Murphy mostly on midnights, and learned train dispatching, of how you have to anticipate trains being ordered. You found out from the chief dispatcher, said, we've got a westbound ordered here in St. Thomas for a certain time, and we have an eastbound ordered in Niagara Falls, Ontario for a certain time. And so you start getting a picture of what was going to come and what you had going. You had a number of trains running on your portion of the division. And so I learned all that and got okayed on it after I think 4 weeks of training. They paid me to learn to try on the Guaranteed Extra Board to be a dispatcher, earn operator's wages, minimum wage. But anyway, I succeeded, and next thing I know, they're asking me to relieve this guy and that guy in the dispatcher's office. Not only agents up and down the line, but here I was elevated, and finally a regular position came up, and I was entitled for it, and I got it. So I spent 5.5 years midnights, and then I worked a swing job by choice for many, many years, instead of the midnights, and so sometimes I passed up the 4 to 12 job. I didn't like the 4 to 12. That was not good. But I ended up working there till 1989. So I worked there about 23 years upstairs as train dispatcher, looking out on the back of Central Park, which became the A&P store over the years. Good memory of that. Thank you.